Well, I think we've heard a diversity of topics expressed, and I'd like to open it up to the audience.
I agree.
Questions for our panelists? Yes.
Great stuff, thank you. The issue of physicians not reading the label. 6 weeks ago or so, the FDA came out with a new labeling format. And one of the new sections was how to talk to your patient about this drug, which is terrific, but it does assume that doctor is reading the label in the first place. There's been some discussion that with a drug pre-approval, a company would have to create kind of a detailing aid for the PI. What other type of solutions are out there to actually help the physician better understand the product that they might be prescribing?
Yeah, I would say
Please
one.
repeat the question.
Yeah,
for
okay.
recording.
So the question is, what are the new tools that are available to help the physician, better understand the label? I was going to comment for a second on one of the aspects of the REMS law, the one that's been actually most commonly implemented, and that's the patient guide. And I'd be very interested in other panelists and people from the audience who've been involved. Some of you probably have helped to write those patient guides, but I like them. I think that writing something in lay language for the patient that says what to expect from a drug is very good because it stimulates conversation. Patients will read it and they'll then ask further questions of their physician, and it puts pressure on the physician to have the answers. If your patient's challenging you, then you better read the label because you need to know how to answer them. So I think patient guides are a very, very good way to do it. I almost think, though, that we need some better kind of almost dumbed down label. I mean, God, you get into the depths of the pharmacokinetics and, and everything else in there, and, it just seems so obscure. And I'm a guy who tries to read labels. I've made a rule for myself that when a new drug comes on the market and I start to use it, I always get out the product insert and read it. So at least I know something about the drug. And but I doubt if very many people do that.
Yeah, well, in addition to what you've said, I think, these labels serve multiple purposes. So one is to communicate to the physician, and the other is an aid to help the physician communicate to the patients. But they're also written from the perspective of minimizing liability. So there's a whole other agenda in these, and consequently you get these very long lists. It's improved recently by prioritizing it, but if you really try to read everything that's being covered, it's hard to know what's really important. So that's another issue. Another question. Yes, here.
We're talking about innovation and patient safety, and one of the groups I think has really impacted our industry a lot in the profession is this group called trial lawyers. Oh. And it's having a profound effect on everything we do from an industry and from a practice standpoint. So I'd like to hear the panel's comments about how do trial lawyers play? Is that I don't want to say it's a good thing or a bad thing. Is there a role for these guys? Is it? And Peter, you just wrote an excellent article on Fosamax a few months back. So I'd like to hear the panel's comments on that.
So you want to know about comments about the role of trial lawyers?
Change to our industry, yes or no? And is it a good effect or bad effect? Is it excessive, or is it a good thing?
Okay. So the question is the role of trial lawyers, the impact on the industry. Is it a good thing, bad thing, or excessive? Well, I mean, I would be very hesitant to offer an opinion or a judgment on, that they're all snakes or the opposite. I would just say that in the 6 years that I've been covering the industry, their presence is, to me, is very visible. I've been to a few trials. I've been contacted by them with ideas about, hey, you might want to look into this or that.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that's a great secret. I mean, that they have an interest in doing that. And that would go, that would touch not only on, well, I mean, I guess trial lawyers specifically, you would most likely think of the product liability cases. But then there's also, this whole qui tam whistleblower industry, sort of, so to speak. You know, I would just say it's, you know, I think there's a lot of activity. I think, you know, from my perspective, they do have a big impact on the industry. I wouldn't I wouldn't want to say whether it's good or bad. I feel like that would be taking sides, and I would just say, you know, I think they've exposed things that have been newsworthy. So.
Yeah. You know, it's a dual-edged sword, really, and you know, I have very mixed feelings about it. You know, I won't talk to them, even though I've written a lot about drug safety. I just absolutely will not interact with them. I think that for those of us in the academic community, keeping a distance from that is extremely important. And you know, they've stopped calling; they don't bother anymore. But look, there have been times when there has been a lack of transparency. The cases where there have been big liability have been cases where the makers of the product were not transparent about what they knew about safety. And the presence of the trial lawyers has served a positive impact there, because it's basically put the fear of God into people that maybe we better disclose this, because if we don't, and ultimately this goes the wrong way, it's going to really up our liability risk. On the other hand, they're vultures, and they're in it for the money. They're not in it for patient safety. You know, there's no passion there. I mean, our passion as physicians is to protect the patient and represent the patient. They're representing their financial interests extremely well. And so I have this sort of dual-edged, you know, kind of view of it that makes it very uncomfortable for me.
I'm sorry, Mark, please.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that it certainly leads to a series of trade-offs. We were talking about label complexity. The reason labels are complicated is because the devil's in the details, and for disclosure purposes, companies feel the need to provide that kind of information up front. It also is antithetical to the idea of driving down costs, because it certainly is a component of costs that drug companies, drug developers take into account when they're undergoing their calculus of how to price and what they need to prepare for. But the safeguard is when things are uncovered or emergent events are uncovered, there's a voice there that provides a balance and makes sure that things are being paid attention to.
But the other side of the fear of God is that many patients who would benefit from a drug self-discontinue as a result of media stories. So the combination often of a trial lawyer and the media can sometimes is good. Mm-hmm. It clarifies, shines a spotlight on a situation, but sometimes there are unintended consequences that actually can have big impacts on populations of people.
Like Michelle Bachmann.
Like Michelle Bachmann, who changed my life on Wednesday night, and Thursday morning, when she thought that a certain vaccine might cause mental retardation. We're still hunting for that data. We haven't found it yet.
Yeah.
Larry, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, there's a common theme running through all of our comments, and also the last two questions, actually, which is the theme of communication, and transparency is really part of communication, practice situations at the individual patient level. For the most part, they're due to inadequate communication between the doctor and the patient before a therapy was administered. You didn't tell me there was a risk of my foot falling off, and my foot fell off, and that was the cause. If the patient was, with a well-documented conversation saying there's this possibility, and that's really been well documented. I think the same thing that applies to all of this, and I think it's very relevant to this issue about information about drugs before they're administered, because I do read the package inserts, and there is a lot of, it's a very poor means of communication to me as a practicing physician, especially because very few patients in the cancer field are getting one drug. They're getting several drugs together. And you talk about REMS. I don't know how that applies. That's an active discussion between ASCO and the FDA now, actually, in terms of how, because every one of my drugs is a dangerous drug. I don't touch a drug unless it's dangerous. That's the theme of my life. Not only that, but I actually, very little of what I do is by the package insert, because I combine things. And combinations are really not, there's literature supporting it. It's all evidence-based, but is it label level, information? The answer is really no. So and I do think the answer has to be, I'm going back, not to electronic medical record per se, but to electronic communications. And I think that there are other fields that we ought to think about that really are way ahead of us in terms of communicating information. For example, museums. And anybody who's gone to a really modern, innovative museum now, I mean, there's lots of ways they're communicating what's in that exhibit. I mean, there's what's on the walls, there's the labels on the walls, there's also apps that you can download into your smartphone, you know, and then there's books that they sell at the end of it, and there are many means of communication. They've got a website, you know, and then you can have it on your tablet as you're going through, and then your earphones. I mean, I've already mentioned like 12 different ways of communicating, and different people get different information different ways, and the same person may get it. So there are a lot of people that are way ahead of us, you know, in other fields in terms of actually transmitting information that's really useful information. The other is the interactiveness, which I think is really critically important. If I'm treating somebody with a drug, that the information I may want to transmit or how I emphasize it may change during the course of the therapy. If a tumor is shrinking, the relative cost-benefit equation changes, as opposed to if you don't know if the tumor is going to shrink before you administer the drug, and so that also is a modification. And education is not the answer, because there's no human mind that could hold all of this, or hold all of this, especially as it's rapidly changing. So how are we going to educate doctors, how are we going to educate patients? You just can't. There's just too much information. The question is, how are we going to communicate this information in a usable fashion in real time, in an interactive sense? And I really do think that the information technology revolution is the way that's going to get us out of this.
I think that's a great point, and the healthcare lags far behind other industries in using technology in innovative ways, especially with consumers. We're doing something, for instance, where we use for informed consent purposes multimedia modules done at the sort of the 5th grade reading level, but multimedia modules where you can access online, or we'll give somebody a tablet and let them look at it. We started doing that for malpractice reasons. It allowed us to document the fact that a patient had heard exactly the things that they needed to hear, but what we found was patient satisfaction went through the roof when we gave it to them. So it really, in fact, wasn't about malpractice at all, but it was a better way of communicating with people. And I wonder, you know, we use that for informed consent, not for pharmaceuticals. Is that the kind of thing that we should and can be using instead of inserts?
If you do it at a 5th grade level, even Michelle Bachman can understand it. The
I released you from diplomacy.
okay, all right, okay, yeah, sorry. You know, I wanted to, if I may for a moment, to sort of throw something out that you raised, Michael, in your introductory remarks that I think is really important. And that is this shrinking number of NMEs, new molecular entities coming to market, and the worry that engenders in a lot of us. Now, look, it's not true in every field. I mean, cancer has been fabulous, but in cardiovascular, we've certainly not had a lot of NME.
In many cases, as a financial investment as well.
Larry.
Yeah. I haven't thought of that, actually, and so, I mean, I'm in favor of doing a lot of different experiments simultaneously and see what pans out. But I think that, and it's a big problem in cancer as well. We're not doing great, and we're coming up mostly the cogeners. We're going after all the same small number of targets, and it's not all that different. And part of the real problem, of course, is that, you know, corporations are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to maximize, you know, the value for the shareholders, you know, and price-earnings ratio and quarterly reports really drive the agenda. Not sales, per se. Sales is sort of a way of in there, but, you know, often innovation and excitement will, you know, affect your stock price, you know, before there's any change in sales. And we all know this. Everybody in the room is aware of what I'm saying. There's another way to go, which I just want to throw out another idea, which I think has worked extremely well in many industries, except for we haven't applied it, which is, I think capitalism is the solution, by the way. I mean, I'm a big favor of the power of capitalism for actually changing the world. I think the problem is the size of our pharmaceutical companies. And I think that is that because a failure in a cardiovascular drug can affect the development of an infectious disease drug, and the failure there can affect the development of a cancer drug. A fantastic drug that we were actually working on, you know, we had to stop development because, you know, the company had to sort of pull back its investment because of the failure of a clinical trial in another area and so on. This happens really all the time. It doesn't take, this is I think the thing that I, you know, in my advanced age and my advanced degree of progression in the field, I didn't really even realize until very recently. It doesn't take that much money to get a drug from an idea through phase 2. for the demonstration of activity. It takes a lot of money to get it through phase 3, and it gets a lot of to drive through the regulatory situation that we've been talking about. But it really does not cost that much money to take an idea or a new molecule through the animals, through large animal toxicology, and through even developing diagnostics, even developing other things, and taking it through phase 1 and then taking it through phase 2 and seeing, does it work? And most drugs that actually go through a well-designed program of well-designed program through phase 2B, a mature phase 2 trial, actually have some merit. And I think the success rate when you take it to phase 3 at that point. And I don't think big pharma should be doing that. I think that big pharma should be involved in picking it up from phase 2. And I think our academic institutions should have small spin-off companies, like has been done in other areas of technology. I mean, think of MIT, small spin-off companies, with very modest investment. You don't need much, to do it, to take the drugs through with a profit motive for the institution and for the investors and for the inventors, frankly, to spur innovation on that end. All right, and then for big pharma to pick up the drugs at the end of phase 2 to really drive them through all the way, where the success rate would be very high, and it wouldn't affect, because most of the losses would really be occurring before the level of getting into the phase 3. I mean, I think it's a business model that might work, and it's worked in many areas. I mean, honestly, computer science, for example, other areas of technological development, and we just haven't applied it to the area of drug development, and I think that's another experiment that we should try.
Well, the NIH is spurring drug discovery with an expenditure now allocating about 5% of its budget. But I wanted to take a somewhat different point of view of this, of the Me Too problem, because I think the Me Too problem ignores the time to develop a drug. So what's commonly said is, gee, somebody's got a drug out there that looks pretty good. I'm going to go make variations 1 through 5 on it, start a program, get it across the finish line, and make a little money. Well, it takes 10 to 15 years to make a drug. So what's actually happening is the new target appears, and a bunch of companies simultaneously make the investment to pursue it for a decade. There's no chemist on the planet who can say this molecule is going to do better in an outcome study or a large safety study than this other molecule. It cannot be done at the drug discovery level. So bringing things through phase 2 is a very nice idea, but actually most things nowadays don't fail for efficacy in phase 2. And the problem is the huge investment for the big evidence base, the big outcome study. And so I just think we need to put that in perspective and understand the terms of the race. Everybody's starting the race, going out of the gate almost at the same time, and you can't be sure of who the winner is. There's no way for a good chemist or pharmaceutical scientist to predict that early in the first decade, I would say, of discovery. And I'm going to give the audience a chance to say something.
I'd like to answer that at some point.
I agree with that, although I think Steve's notion of rewarding the first output as a positive incentive is still a reasonable proposition.
Right.
I agree that predicting is hard to do, as Yogi said, particularly when it comes to the future. There is, though, not to repeat the previous panel we had this morning, but there is another pretty powerful disincentive that's already underway, that's working, sort of working, and that is the payer, another double-edged sword. But no matter how interested the pharmaceutical company, chemist on up, down, do for a living, can at least at this point influence that early on. And the reality is the payers are voting with their feet. And for the 6th antipsychotic or the 7th ACE inhibitor or the 9th DPP-4, you're going to see, especially when the first one is generic, you're going to see payers saying, we don't care what you want to write. If you write it as a physician, it's going to be third tier, or there's going to be something else going on that's going to be a pretty powerful disincentive. So I think we have to keep that in mind, and that you may not like that, but that's one way this is happening. And I think the more the industry's aware of this earlier on, that they can have productive discussions about it.
I wanted to, if I may just comment.
Interesting idea, just a comment on my question.
Yeah.
Something which would have to be sort of factored into it is supposing the first company with this incentive of extra patent exclusivity fails, but fails, the mechanism would have to accommodate failure by that company, but failure late enough in the process to where an awful lot of very useful knowledge and science has been generated, to where the rest of the field can somehow bear that. I don't know how that would work out. So then, obviously, you don't want the whole mechanism to work to the advantage of the fast followers in there. There should be some advantage which continues to accrue to the inventor company which has been brave enough to actually take this, but actually never cross the line. So it has all those sort of subtleties, but I think it's a very interesting idea. The other brief observation I'd make on the earlier point about the labels, I'm not sure that whether liability litigation management really complicates labels. We don't have the liability issues in Europe that exist in this country. The labels are just as complicated. They're just as impossible to read.
We don't have as many lawyers.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
Peter, you were going to say, Peter.
To Steve Nissen's point, I think that's a very good idea. It's not, it's novel, although there is some precedent in terms of orphan drug, for instance.
Yes.
Or pediatric exclusivity extension.
Yes.
Which doesn't have to come from IOM. It can come, of course, from agencies, which is in that case. And I think it, in fact, should be extended beyond that. And that is another big problem. That is developing drugs for prevention. It's almost impossible within patent life. Yet it could be very easy done if the exclusivity extends sufficiently to develop those drugs and still get the value out of them, which is.
I wanted to comment on something that came up earlier, which is this issue of NMEs versus developing, congeners. And one of the things that we've done to ourselves, and I think, by the way, we in academia and industry are equally to blame here, is that we've made phase 3 trials unbelievably expensive, and we've done it to ourselves. I mean, we have incredible numbers of laboratories and visits and all of that. And there are people in the academic side that think that we've gone way, way too far, and that we really need is to get back to large and simple trials where we aren't collecting so much material and spending so much money as a way to maybe make it a little less costly. And I wondered if anybody in industry has any comment on that. I know Rob Califf makes this case about as well as anybody, where he says, look, why should it cost $500, $600 million to do a phase 3 trial? Can't we do this in a less expensive fashion? I'd rather see more things taken into phase 3 than we're taking into phase 3 now, but the only way to do that is to make phase 3 less expensive. Can we do this?
I mean, if you're talking about targeted therapy in cancer, the answer is no. And maybe we don't need the very large trials. In other words, maybe smaller trials. And we're getting probably more information now in the oncology area from what we call randomized phase 2s, which are like little phase 3s than we are from the very large phase 3s. And the phase 3s are mostly important in cancer because you're looking for very small differences, and the public is demanding, an end to small differences. They want to see big differences, and they're right, and we agree with them. So there's an alternative, which is smaller trials with the technology. But in cancer, when you're dealing with the complexity, especially when dealing with the importance of diagnostics, I think we have to take the other approach. And maybe in cardiovascular, you're talking about cholesterol lowering and ultimate outcome. You're going to go in a different direction. We probably need the mix of both things. In that regard. So I just want to make one quick statement and just sort of leave it out there and let it hang at this. Most drugs that are successful therapeutically, like in phase 2, that fail in phase 3, fail because of the wrong dose and schedule, and that we have not spent enough time really developing optimal dose and schedule of drugs before we get them into people. Again, I'm only talking about cancer here, so that ought to be kept in mind. Sometimes it's just unbelievable to me how cavalier the dose and schedule is chosen for agents, as opposed to having good science behind it.
Questions? Yes, please.
I'd like Steve's comments about making phase 3 simpler. The assumption is, first, that phase 2 is predictive of success in phase 3. That's one. The second part is, it's also an assumption that you answered all the complicated questions in phase 2, so you can keep it simple and do the type of studies that the Oxford ISIS group does with large numbers of patients, but asking very, very simple 1 or 2 questions. That works for products that are already in the market, but not products that are being introduced for the first time in general.
Comments?
Yeah, well,
Yale's got a
we actually are advocates of large and simple. And the problem has been it starts off large and simple, and then there are regulatory requirements, and there are commercial requirements concerning country involvement, and it just starts a large snowball. And yeah, so large and simple, I think, is a great premise, but and especially with an innovative product, it gets very, very difficult.
Maybe one of the problems is large, not part of the conversation. How do you develop a program where when you go into phase 3, you're fielding a smartly designed adaptive clinical trial?
Yes.
This morning we talked about the payer issues relative to that. The relative is bringing the drug to market in a more, not necessarily better, but more efficient way, more targeted way. How do you incentivize, how do you change the culture from large randomized controlled trials to more smartly designed adaptive clinical trials?
I guess I'll take that one. The question was, how do you get trials to be smarter and adaptive? First of all, I think that's a very, very good point. And I think that there are certainly some companies that have figured out ways to do that. Now, the challenge is making sure that you can get the regulators to buy into that. And they have not always stepped up to the plate on this idea. But, you know, this question you raised about, getting the dose wrong, well, it does happen. And you may not know that until the end of a huge phase 3 program. And so an example of an adaptive trial that I think we need to think together with regulators about how to do is maybe you start out phase 3 with 2 doses. You know, I've thought about this at Yale for the CETP inhibitors. You know, is more CETP inhibition better, or is a moderate amount better? Well, there may be ways to start out phase 3 with 2 doses and do an appropriate interim analysis that then lets you drop one of the doses. I mean, there are all kinds of things that can be done, and if they're done in a highly statistically rigorous fashion with the full buy-in of regulators, I think we can reduce costs. But, you know, we haven't been willing to do that. I mean, the problem is we've developed this model where the trials just get bigger and more expensive and more complex every year, to the point where somebody looks at an NME and says, do I really want to spend $1 billion? Do I think the chances of this working are high enough to warrant that investment? And they're sometimes not investing. We may be losing an opportunity for an innovative drug.
Yeah, Steve, those kinds of decisions come into play when you're trying to calculate the return on the investment. And it's, in some cases, when I was doing consulting, companies make a very explicit decision about how far they're willing to go and how much they're willing to invest for the type of drug they're developing in the market they're developing, the market they're seeking. But there's no question that things like adaptive designs, Bayesian statistics, integrated phase 2, 3 drug development programs, binary arms, 2 arms looking at different dosage and different regimens, can assist with lowering the overall developments of the overall cost of development. There is a high regulatory burden, and I don't think the regulatory authorities worldwide are there yet. There's not a glowing endorsement of some of these innovative trials to be able to use them to facilitate drug development yet at the agencies. That's heightened the need when you undertake these kinds of programs for things like special protocol assessments.
I'm going to invite people on the side to sit, if they wish to take their seats over here. You won't be disturbing us if you go over there. I'm going to try to shift the conversation a little because I want to get a little bit more airtime for global health, which we haven't spent as much time on. And Peter, I actually wanted to ask this one to you. We have many companies have very active corporate social responsibility programs. They make donations of drugs. They often make donations of money to help get those drugs to the people who need them and educate populations of people. And there is a kind of some tension and dynamic between that money that might have been returned to shareholders versus a outright philanthropic effort by for-profit entities. And I'm wondering from your perspective if you have some insight or some guidance to us, because you sit at this interface of the pharmaceutical industry and the investment community.
Sure. Well, from my perspective, I can't say that I've seen or heard firsthand a lot of evidence that say, you know, Wall Street or investors are getting frustrated about that issue. There's other issues that they're frustrated about, but they, you know, I really haven't heard too much about people expressing concern that, you know, this company is spending too much on developing countries or from a philanthropic standpoint. But you know, occasionally you will hear, you know, for instance, when I listen to these quarterly conference calls for earnings reports, sometimes you'll hear analysts ask questions about something that would fall into that general category of charity or philanthropy. You know, they might ask about patient assistance programs and say, well, you know, what effect is that having on sales? How are you accounting for that? You know, why did you increase the level of assistance? And you know, like I said, I don't think I wouldn't say that that's indicative of a big backlash, but they do pay attention to it. And I do think that is sort of part of a bigger picture of tension that the industry faces when it's trying to satisfy Wall Street, in some cases, versus societal interests, or what some people would define as societal interests. And I just, you know, I think there's been some very interesting examples where companies have had different reactions to shareholder pressure. And so it's sort of created this contrast in strategies, you know, whether it's with Merck choosing to, you know, for the most part, sustain its level of R&D spending. And around the same time that Merck made that clear, Pfizer made clear that they were going to substantially cut R&D spending. And like I said, I can't take sides on you know, who's doing the right approach, but I just found it very interesting that the market reaction was also very divergent. Pfizer's shares went up 4% when they announced that, and I think Merck was off 2.5%.
Interesting.
On that day. And so so I think that's, you know, that's a real tension that these companies face, and that also gives me more to write about.
So just to that last comment, which is correct about Pfizer shares going up when they decided to decrease their R&D spend, and Merck going down when it increased, is in sharp contrast to the 1980s and 1990s, when if a CEO of a company like Merck announced an increase in the R&D budget, the shares went up because Wall Street thought they must have something in there that they're investing in that's going to come out of the pipeline a few years later.
I mean, the big difference is the timing of the payout. You know, I mean, you know, if somebody's going to cut their investment, that's going to be a very good company to invest in for 3 months. You know, and then you get out, and then you know, somebody else is going to have a better product down the line. So it's a matter of the rapidity with which investments churn now, which is a very big difference than compared to 1980.
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
To Larry's point, doesn't that tell you that the market has a fundamental question about the business model?
Sure.
That there are deep uncertainties about whether the business model needs to change, to your point of whether to use academic and translational medicine institutes into development. But that cuts away Big Pharma's discovery, which is what you pay for. That's the value premium that something's discovered. So somewhere along the line, the business model has to change, because the previous panel about value, the value proposition coming under question is also a business model.
Yeah, I think that's a question for Pete, too.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we should restate the question so that they can get it, yeah.
That these stock market reactions, does that indicate that there's, I guess, a hunger for maybe a different business model, or the questions about the business model right now? I mean, I think there's just enormous frustration about what has happened over the last 10 years among investors, and I think they are And just off the top of my head, without thinking it through too much, I mean, I think an example of that is this company called Galien that's based in Canada, I believe, and they, you know, their stock has been through the roof this year, and they're very upfront about saying, you know, we're not going to do a whole lot of in-house research. We're going to go out and buy these companies, and we're going to buy them for their cash flow. We're going to buy them for, you know, some range of products, but we're really not buying them for their pipelines. And in fact, you know, they might just get rid of the pipelines. I mean, they've said those sorts of things in certain circumstances when they've gone after companies. So to me, I think that's one example of sort of, you know, a receptiveness among investors for something different. And even a lot of the cutbacks that the big pharma has already made, you know, I can always find an analyst that says, you know, that's not enough. That's and not necessarily from a cutting perspective, but people saying that, you know, they need to try something different, more radical, more transformational.
Two comments on that. One is, when you look at novel business models, one question that always comes up is, what's the sustainable competitive advantage? And if it's insight or if it's just cash, then how durable is that kind of a business model, and when does the next thing come along that displaces you? The second is as an industry, healthcare competes for investment dollars and for investors' attention among a lot of other options and a lot of other opportunities. And you kind of have to ask yourself, is the development cycle, is the drug development and research cycle compatible with the environment today that investors are seeking in terms of their returns? They can flock to energy, they can flock to other industries that healthcare, by virtue of the investment required, just simply can't keep up with.
There's another problem here, and that's that there's a reality that we are going to face here, and very soon. If you look at all the proposals now for cutting the federal budget, at the top of everybody's list is Medicare, is healthcare spending. And so if there is a problem with the value equation now in investing in a new molecular entity, just wait, because I think that is going to hit us very, very hard. Now, is it right or wrong? Well, we all know we've got too big a deficit. But, you know, everybody sort of sees the healthcare expenditure, the Medicare and Medicaid, as the low-hanging fruit. I know there's a proposal on the table now to cut Part D Medicare way back. And, you know, they think that the senior drug benefit program is too expensive. Well, that is not going to stimulate innovation, I can assure you. And if I know anything about capitalism, I think that's probably right. And, you know, that's why I was proposing some of these alternative ways of rewarding innovation, as if, you know, if it's not as lucrative, well, maybe there's another way you can make it valuable for people to spend the money on R&D. I mean, there's a reality here, everybody. If money's not going to get spent on R&D in the pharmaceutical industry, we're not going to get new drugs, which means we're not going to improve human health. I mean, there's no way around that.
Just, you know, I agree with you, Stephen. I would extend that. It's not just that we're going to see huge cuts in healthcare spending. We're going to see a different way that we'll spend those dollars. And so, truthfully, on the hospital side, in the past, in a fee-for-service environment, perhaps I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we didn't care how much something cost. It wasn't a major component of the equation. That's changing rapidly, and so it's not just that there will be less reimbursement, and there will be a lot less reimbursement, but the way we will be reimbursed in the future means that we care a great deal about how much something costs, and we will be very reticent on the provider side in ways that we haven't in the past to spend the dwindling dollars that we have on expensive new therapies.
Plus, I'm not sure, I think it will really dampen innovation, but I'm not sure it will end it, because there's the rest of the world. And then I think importing drugs, I think, is going to be a real sticker shock when we start having to import most of the drugs discovered elsewhere in the world. We're going to experience something that the rest of the world might have experienced. So I think there will be innovation, and I think we'll see the price of imports the way we see it on other goods.
Yeah, you know, I'm not so sure, because, you know, whether the company is based in the U.S. or elsewhere, the reality is that most of the profit in drugs is in the United States. And so when yeah, I mean, I understand, but you know, I think that that's not likely to change. simply because there are only a few countries in the world where drug prices are not regulated, and we're one of the few. Now, we may not last much longer with that environment, but, the reality is you can't make a lot of money, I don't think. I mean, you guys tell me from the industry if I'm right or wrong. You can't make a lot of money in other countries, and you certainly can't make it in the third world countries where the pricing is going to be very narrow.
Well, except the market is like huge. I mean, it turns out you get into cancer, you're talking about small profit per pill, but you're talking about more than 90% of the world is not getting those pills right now in cancer or not getting cancer therapy at all. And so if one really has a global perspective and one sees the opportunities, I think that there's an economic incentive to developing medicines that can be sold at not a very high price, but globally to really make a difference. But I think, we've been talking about the same issue here, which is, it used to be that people were value investors. They'd put some money in and they would leave it, Warren Buffett, the snowball effect, Now, there's churning. I mean, people, move their investments around every 4 milliseconds, right? And I think that the thing is that it's a very different investor model now in terms of how it's going and whether we can have true innovation that's going to take a few years before you have a product, even a product that could have global impact, and that the market can make up for the relatively low price per pill. Whether investors support that or not, I think is a big question.
I know very little about the pharmaceutical industry, so I believe you when you say that you can't make money in developing countries. But I know a great deal about other industries, and having spent years running a division at GE, for instance, it would be inconceivable at GE not to have a major component of what you do be thinking about developing countries. Spent a number of years working with Cisco, and they're not just working on stuff that's sold at a very high cost to the States or to Europe. I worked with them on low-cost stuff to be used in India. And so, I mean, other industries are figuring this out. You're right. It's a huge market out there. I don't know enough about the pharmaceutical industry, but certainly others have figured out that the developing world is quite important.
Yeah, just a quick anecdote on this is that we're talking about getting cancer care delivered to a developing part of the world, and I was visiting it, and so I visited a village where I didn't see any shoes, and the question is how are we going to get the drugs there? And as I'm wandering through this little village, about every third person had a cell phone out. You're right. And then I went to talk to the village elders, and they had their computer, that was connected to the internet. And so somebody has solved the problem of delivering something pretty high tech to that village. We just haven't gotten medicines there.
Something which could form part of the answer to this is that because our industry traditionally has been a very high margin industry, major companies in the US and Europe for new products always insist on worldwide rights. It would be unthinkable for a Merck or a Pfizer or a GSK, Novartis, to bring out one of their major drugs and say, you know what, we're only going to have rights for this in the US, and we're going to share the risk and the cost of developing this drug with Chinese players and Indian players and Brazilian players for rights which those companies will have in those geographies. The aerospace industry has done this for decades. The automobile industry, but because they're much lower margin businesses, the risks are probably the same. The time frame is as extended. So that, there could be other creative ways where international pharma would have to try and get together and say the old model where, Merck has insisted on global rights or Novartis, that's a thing of the past. We can no longer afford that.
Can I go back to something that Peter said in his opening remarks? Peter, you talked about the early safety signal communications that the FDA was mandated to do under Dow. Inside the agencies, before they issued their first statement, there was great worry that it was blown out of proportion and result in unintended consequences. And some have happened and some have not happened. But within the newsroom, what's the internal conversation that you have with yourself relative to what could the unintended consequences of a report on a safety issue be? It doesn't seem to be the same weight as to kind of talking about new discoveries in a very exciting way.
The question is, what's the discussion in the newsroom about reporting on some of these FDA communications and mentioning that within the FDA there were some discussion about whether there would be unintended consequences of putting out earlier communications. I would say, I would say in general, we're definitely conscious of that potential to put out, to unduly alarm people. So I do think we try to, put things in perspective. Now, I wouldn't say, I can't think of a time where, we just flat out refuse to report something just for that reason alone. Because I think, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is especially me, I write primarily, most of my stories originate on the financial newswire. And so the clients are brokers and things like that. And then, then it reaches a wider audience in the journal. But, sometimes a piece of information like that isn't just useful for communicating to patients and doctors and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's useful for investors. So investors will want to know if there's an early signal even before they or anyone else makes a conclusion as to whether that makes a final conclusion about whether that signal is real or not. I do think there are times when the FDA will issue an alert and they'll say we've moved this adverse event from somewhere lower in the label to somewhere higher in the label. We will sometimes make judgment calls that's not really a story, depending on the situation. So I would say, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's just one of the things that off the top of my head I can think of that, where we would kind of weigh whether or not it's a news story or not.
Bob? I wanted to ask a related question about communication, and something I know Michael wrote about his prior life and his new life. When there's a breaking story, and frankly, people get their news these days from Twitter and from social networks more than they do reading a label. The company usually goes into panic mode, and there's big meetings, and the lawyers decide with the communications experts and sometimes a little voice from something I was before chief medical officer, what should we say? And the company usually constructs a very terse statement. And it usually ends with saying, talk to your doctor. And I know when Steve gets interviewed, some columnists, pick up at the end of his conversation, make sure you talk to your doctor before you stop taking the medicine. But the reality is, we often say to ourselves, what the hell is the doctor going to say? We've just seen some new information.
They don't know.
Statisticians,
They know less.
epidemiologists. Your poor doctor is probably
Clueless.
not even aware of it when his patient calls him or is reading, the Daily News version of whatever just came out. So, unfortunately, the other counter movement is that companies have become more and more restrictive in their ability to communicate with doctors. We don't take them out to dinner anymore. We aren't allowed to detail in some hospitals. And as you know, the FDA hasn't been very clear about their policy on social network participation by companies who might be able to add something, although we're guilty until proven otherwise that we have a vested interest and we're spinning it our way. So I just wonder, those of you who are either in the media or Steve, even when you try to talk to people, what is the answer for trying to get a patient to go to someone who they do trust, who wrote the prescription before, to put in context some breaking information which not many people except the person who wrote that article and got published somewhere really understand?
This is really a tough one because, you're right. I always try if there's some issue about drug safety to say, no, look, nobody should ever stop taking a medication because they heard a news report. That's a very dangerous thing for people to do, and you try to say that. Usually they'll leave that in the piece and not cut it out, but they'll cut it out sometimes, which always bothers me. But the doctor then has a lot less information than anybody else, and the question is, what do you do about it? I think we have not used the digital age communication techniques well for getting this information out. Now, look, tweeting isn't going to solve it. You can't say anything in a Twitter feed, so that's not going to work. But there are things that can be done, and one of the things we talked about earlier was labels, and I always wonder, if imagine a day in which, when drugs are developed, an app is developed for the drug that would have information for the patient. And when you get the dispensed, you know, in the pharmacy, you get access to something, lets you download an application with information you can read or can check out a symptom. I'm just thinking out loud with you about the fact that in this modern instant communication world that we live in, we're still have these paper inserts. And, you know, given my age now, I need a magnifying glass to read those product inserts, you know, because my glasses don't work as well as they used to. And, you know, I can imagine my 85-year-old patients, you know, trying to read any of that stuff, and it just isn't working.
Our professional societies could also play a big role there, you know, and so ASCO certainly is stepping up to the plate and developing a rapid learning system, for example, a way of communicating to physicians, having physicians communicate back their experience in a rapid way. You know, if you're dealing every day with 100 different drugs and you have 100 different apps, it could get complicated. But societies could really boil this down, you know, very, very rapidly with good expert opinion and good communications opinion. And so I would see an expanded role for our professional societies in serving their members by being able to provide that kind of information. And certainly when there's breaking news in a cancer story, you go to the ASCO website right now and you could get the practicing physician get the information they need to be able to talk to their patient, you know, essentially instantaneously.
Yeah, in my case, I mean, I think I will try to capitalize on the internet by at least you know, given that I'll have a space limitation in what I can write, but if I can do it and I think it's useful, I'll include links to, say, you know, the official FDA communication. You also raised the point about the companies issuing terse statements. So another thing that sometimes plays a role is that sometimes these either safety issues or even an efficacy issue from a drug come from a clinical trial where there's an abstract for an upcoming medical meeting. And the abstract is up online for anyone to see. And smart investors and hedge fund people have already found that abstract, and the stock's moving. And this is the first that whatever kind of issue it is has come to light. So I'm in a position where, you know, I have to explain to my readers why the stock is moving. Maybe it's because a certain trial had X number of deaths for a drug. And this hasn't previously been, you know, fully disclosed by the company, at least in a way that, you know, is widely disseminated. And, you know, and then I call the company, and it may take them some time, like you say, to craft a response, or they may even be bound by sort of a gag embargo from the medical conference because they're participating. And so that kind of limits the information that gets out there. I don't know what the easy answer is, but I just wanted to throw that out there as another factor that influences how we report things.
I think those kinds of constraints weigh heavily into how a company responds, the measured response that it needs to take, because it has to consider the consequences of any communication. It hasn't. Sometimes these things are a surprise to the company. They're out of its control, and they need to be able to move quickly. They just can't move as quickly as social media do.
Questions? Well, I think maybe we will end this session a few minutes early, and I really want to thank our panelists. The discussion was really great. Really, I think each and every one of you taught us something today, and I really want to thank the audience for their very active participation. Thanks.
Thank you. Good job, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.